Welcome back to the Keaton Knife Shop. Today's video is going to be a simple tutorial for beginner knife makers on how to effectively attach handle scales onto their fixed blade knives. The goal of this channel is to document my knife making journey and share any tips and tricks that I learn along the way. My hope is that the videos will add value to the community. If you think they are, please subscribe to the channel for future content. The method that I'll be outlining today is most effective when the user has a drill press and a cant twist clamp. However, this strategy can also be utilized with cheaper clamps and a hand drill. The first thing you're going to have to do is mark out where your holes are going to be and then drill the appropriate hole size for the pins or fasteners that you'll be using. In this example, I'm drilling two number 12 holes for corby fasteners and then one center hole that is a number 30 drill bit for an 1/8 of an inch pin. The drilling of your tang will have to be done early in the process while the steel is still soft and before heat treating. After you have ground, heat treated, and tempered your blade, it's time to move on to the step shown here, which is stacking two handle scales under your knife. You'll be using the knife itself as a drill guide for these handle scales. You'll then take a small clamp and clamp the blade to the stacked scales. I like using the cant twist clamp because of its small stature and that it does not get in the way of the drill press's spindle. We'll then head over to the drill press. To keep everything nice and level, we'll use two 3-2-1 blocks to support the assembly. Then I'll line up the drill bit with the first hole and then use a clamp to hold the blade. This may be an abundance of caution, but I'd rather take the time so that I don't have a helicopter-like situation where the blade goes slinging around. Using the blade as a drill guide, we will then drill through both handle scales. After the first hole has been successfully drilled, I will take the clamped assembly and insert a bit of the same size into the hole. This precaution is taken so that the entire assembly will stay in the same orientation while I drill the second hole. We'll then return to the drill press and drill the second hole. After the second hole is drilled, we will also insert another bit into it so that the whole assembly stays aligned. Then we will move the clamp over to the side so that we can drill the center hole. Once the hole is drilled, you can bring the entire assembly over to your workbench and scribe out the outline of the handle. This excess material will be cut off. And then you can carefully scribe the front of your handle curvature. Then it's off to the bandsaw to do some rough cutting of the handle scales as a unit. Once you're done cutting them out, it's time to take them over to the belt sander. I like turning my belt sander down really low so that I don't burn the micarta. The first thing I'll do is I will sure up the front of the scales on a 60 grit ceramic belt in this case. And then I'll move up the belts to something a little finer, normally around the 220 grit belt. I'm taking great care to make sure that the top and bottom of these scales are in line with each other. I'll then put my work rest on and attach a handy little wooden jig that I threw together for the angles in the front of my scales. I'll then clamp this jig onto the work rest and use it as a guide for the scales. But first, I need to mark out the lines that I'll be grinding to. I use a very sophisticated method here with a pencil on my workbench. After the lines have been scribed, I'll come back to the grinder to start using my jig. I'll make sure that the outside of the scale is facing down so that the angle will be on the outside of the scale. Like the front of the scales, we'll start off with a coarse grit belt first and then move on to a finer grit belt. As you start getting close to your scribed lines, you'll want to take these two scales and put them together so you can see if they're symmetrical or not. After you get it pretty close, you can take it over to the hand sanding. I then put the two pieces back together and clamp them to a workbench. You can bring them up to whatever finish that you like. However, you must note that you will not be able to modify the finish on the front of these scales after a knife is together. So it's best to take them up to the finish that you plan on putting on the entire knife handle. We'll then head back to the drill press. Since I'll be using Corby fasteners, I need to use a stepped bit to drill a counterbored hole. I have a more detailed video on the basics of Corby fasteners that I will put in the cards in the top right of your screen. With 1/4 inch handle scales, I'll generally drill 3/16 of an inch into the scale, leaving a 1/16 of an inch for the Corby fastener to seat on. Once the counterbores are drilled, we'll head on over to the granite block and make the scales nice and flat for our glue up. Before gluing the scales up, we'll have to modify the Corby fasteners themselves. They normally come with a fairly large dimension from inside to inside. So the first thing I'll do is I will shorten both the male and the female sides of these Corby fasteners. After doing this many times, you kind of get an eye for it, but it is test and fit. I'm shooting for around 1/4 of an inch from inside to inside head. Also, the Corby fasteners are generally a little larger in OD than the 1/4 inch hole that I drilled, so I have to take this down as well until they fit just right. Now that our pieces are all prepared, it's time for the glue up. The first step is to put on some gloves and clean everything. You want to make sure that all the surfaces are free of any grime or oils so that your epoxy will stick to it very well. I use alcohol for this function, but I've also seen people use acetone with great success. I also like to wrap the blade itself to prevent any epoxy from getting onto the finished blade. In this case, I'm using G-Flex epoxy, where I mix equal parts and stir for about 30 seconds. The first place I put epoxy is in the holes of the bottom scale. I'm calling the bottom scale the left scale when you're looking down the spine of the knife. I put the epoxy in the holes, and then I'll put the female Corby fasteners in first. Then I'll apply epoxy to the face of the inside of the scale, and then to the corresponding side on the knife itself. I try not to get too much epoxy around the holes because you do not want epoxy in the female portions of the Corby fasteners. I then do the same thing with the other scale to put epoxy where the Corbys will be seating, and then epoxy the inside of the scale, and then that side of the knife as well. I'll then line up the two Corbys together, take off a glove, and start using a screwdriver to start the Corbys. Once they're started, I'll generally insert the center pin and then go back and finish tightening the Corbys. You don't want to go too tight with the Corbys, or you could squeeze out all the epoxy from your joint. It's generally a tight enough fit that I don't need to use 2 screwdrivers since the outside Corby is not moving. But sometimes, if it's too loose, I will use another screwdriver. I then take some baking paper and wrap the blade and use a clamp to hold it up. Then I'll take some alcohol and Q-tips and clean up the front of the scales. You need to do this now because you won't be able to do it later. Then bring your assembly inside and let it cure at room temperature for 24 hours before grinding on it. And that's a wrap. In a nutshell, those are the steps that you can take to put a handle on your fixed blade full tang knives in a repeatable fashion with a very small chance of alignment error. All that's left to do is shape your handle and make a sheath. I hope you all enjoyed this week's knife making tutorial, and if you did, please make sure to like this video and nail that subscribe button. Also, if you have any of your own tips for attaching knife handles, please comment in the comment section below. Now get out there and build some knives. I'll catch you guys on the flip side.